G'day Bill, here we are once again.
Delighted to be here, Paul.
Today I wanted to discuss with you some of the things that have been happening around Melbourne. Recently we are aware that there's been the Occupy Wall Street movement, and that's moved to Melbourne. So just to get some reflection and some thoughts of what you see this means to us and what social impact it has.
Well, I think in some of our conversations we've talked about the wondrousness of the Arab Spring, the so-called Jasmine Spring. And it seems to me that we may well, in a year's time, be talking about the Jasmine Spring or the Arab Spring and the Western Summer. Because it seems to me that there are many continuous threads that are expressing themselves in this movement. I think the New York and Europe, or the American and the European Occupy programs are much more diverse, much more spontaneous, and contain a very generous and open-ended perspective. That is, they don't have a set of solid demands. So they're not excluding anyone from participating as part of the 99%. And there's been a lot of criticism of them for that very same reason, that is that they haven't yet got an articulate set of demands. Well, in one way I think that's a great strength of the movement, because it's seeking to remain open, and it's seeking to remain participative and inclusive. And that's a great change from many previous demonstrations that have started out from a particular gripe or level of dissatisfaction, either anti-war or some environmental movement or whatever. But this, it seems to me, has the potential to become something quite broad, quite generous in the way in which it is inclusive, and hopefully that spreads throughout the world, because if it is, it will see a continuation of what is essentially a democratic thrust. There is no significant ideological domination of it, and the notion of a democratic controlled economy is something around which we could all gather and garner support for that sort of proposition.
Within the situation that we've seen around the world, we've seen Great Britain imploding during our winter.
Yep.
We've seen Greece, violence, but most of that can be contributed down to some austere measures that have happened. Sure. In England's case, cutting back educationally, cutting back on welfare services, and we all know that in Greece that there's been this dire financial situation that they've found themselves in, which has been the reason that these movements have sprung into being. Here we don't really have the same issues.
Right. I think what we're seeing here at the moment is an absolutely appropriate response, in the sense that people are aping what they see as occurring, but without spontaneity. And that's the difference in my view, is that here it'll be much more dominated by the existing left-wing organised progressive organisations. And there will be, as there was last Saturday morning when they launched the Occupy Melbourne, a broader audience that came along as a matter of interest, a matter of solidarity in a broad sense of the word, a bit curious and so on to see what it was like. But it will take some time, in my view, for Melbourne to have the same resonance as does New York or any of the American or European cities. And the point you make about the collapse of Britain and the crisis of Greece is significant, because there's no question that in terms of economic status and standing, both of those economies are in far worse trouble than the Australian one is. Although there are many illusions about the Australian economy. Many people would think that there is in fact still a very strong economy. Well, take away the mining industry, and we'd be in exactly the same boat as everyone else. And so it seems to me that we're not that far away from seeing the manifestations. I mean, the Reserve Bank Board are considering dropping interest rates for the first time, and the other economy, so-called, is in a very iffy state. I think the next month or three may see an increase in unemployment figures, but not so dramatic as you've seen in either Greece or Germany, in Greece or the United States or Britain, where the impact is severe. I've seen a couple of brief references to the Irish situation, and Ireland probably hit the high point of the so-called tiger economies in Europe, only to collapse further, probably than any other part of that group of countries. And the fact that the Greeks have had a long-standing commitment to public sector activity as a major employment source means that the bites are going to be much harsher and much more dramatic in the way in which they manifest themselves. So permanent lifelong employment, which we used to laugh when we referred to the Japanese model, was in fact a part and parcel of Greek life, and that will cause, and there as well, it seems to me, you have a much better richer, fuller, left participation in this process. You know, I mean, the communist parties in Greece of all varieties, the anarchist movement's much stronger there, and so I think you'll see, you know, genuine struggles taking place. And if Greece does default, as many pundits are predicting, then it wouldn't be surprising to see some serious social upheavals taking place and a threat to the existing system.
What we've seen as well is in the United States, perhaps the greatest situation of difficulty since the 1930s and the New Deal. And there's been some conjecture that Obama, who was offering such great hope in coming in, has been like Nero fiddling while Rome burns. We saw him a couple of days standing during the Martin Luther King celebrations and almost aping the Martin Luther King, trying to buy into that tradition. And a cynical person would say there's something going on that really needs to be adjusted, not only within the issues of capitalism, but within the very heart of American politics.
Absolutely. Obama, in my view, is the greatest disappointment of my life. You know, in terms of back in 07, 08, in the lead up to that presidential election, he was the most articulate, the most sympathetic sounding voice that I'd heard in American politics for a long time. And there are some good people there, Dennis Kucinich and Nancy Pelosi and others who are, you know, clearly from the progressive side of politics. But Obama shrouded himself in all of the best of the traditions of the American working class. You know, comes out of Chicago, has a connection to the Saul Alinsky model and organising methods, took advantage of that, built an electronic age, a model based absolutely on Alinsky, but without, in one fundamental flaw, without the commitment to delivering on the promises of hope that he articulated at the time. I mean, if he'd been put to an election worldwide, he would have got 90% of the vote. And certainly his speeches in Cairo and his speeches in Europe were profoundly significant speeches, but as it turns out, absolutely hollow, absolutely without any substance whatsoever. And so, as I say, the greatest disappointment of my political life is to see a man who offered so much by way of hope and has delivered so little. In fact, has become George Bush light. You know, I mean, and the current crisis does relate directly to the heart of the problem. Here we have a situation where finance capital has come to dominate over every world institution. You could put up an argument that the Chinese government is outside of their sphere of influence, but only just. But there's not another single government in the world that is capable of withstanding the assault of the interests of finance capital. And you know, you've got to say it's time for us to end the facade that says there is anything of substance in this financial capital market. The markets are unstable. They are inherently gambling, in my view. They're not. They don't have a substantial relationship to any real aspect of the economy. They don't provide employment opportunities. They simply provide gambling opportunities for the ultra rich to enrich themselves even further. And in all of the collapses, we've seen finance capital dictating to governments the resurrection and the saving of the banks and therefore the financial system. And all of that money that was poured into government economies then into the banks was used to pay back the banks. So the banks didn't lose a cracker in that entire process, apart from they just took over and fell down the drain. But certainly that, it seems to me, is where we're at the moment, is that we've got to end that control of the society by finance capital and to restore a democratic approach.
To hop in there, a little over 100 years ago, Karl Marx spoke about the decline of capitalism.
Yes.
We've been waiting a long time
to see the manifestation of it.
Indeed. And there's been a recent spate of thinkers like Zizek, who have been stating that we are coming to the end of capitalism. For good or bad, do you think that we are? Or do you
absolutely. I mean, it's been Marx's insights have been, for me, a guiding light. I mean, I've never been surprised by any of the crises that have emerged within capitalism. Absolutely understand the nature of the essence of the commodity productive process as the mainstay of capitalism itself. And so then when Marx and more importantly Lenin later goes on to talk about imperialism being both the highest stage of capitalism within which finance capital will come to rule the world. That's what's taking place. That's what's being manifest for all to see right now. And without necessarily arguing that you should go back therefore and read Marx. Certainly Marx's understanding, and those who do understand the world from a Marxist perspective, will be in a much better shape to make a contribution today than they were a decade ago or 50 years ago.
Having said that, one thing about capitalism, it showed incredible resilience.
Absolutely.
We've been predicting the death of capitalism
Yes.
for a long time.
Yep.
The 30s we were close,
Yep.
and that was almost taken over by fascism. And
Well, they're the
again, the
choices.
capitalists
Yep.
come out the
Yep.
winners out
Yep.
of the Second World
Yep.
War,
Yep.
despite of the fact that much resistance was done from many different groups and many
Absolutely,
different parts.
absolutely. I mean, it's one of the critical things people need to understand when they have a black and white view that is an anti-communist one, because there are nuances within there that need exploring in order to understand why it was that the choices were fascism or socialism in one sense.
Yeah.
And the fact that the fascists did win in that
Yeah.
period and lead up to the Second World War, and so provoked that war again, the Second War to end all wars, was a product of that decline and degeneration, in my view, of the intellect within the workers' movements, and the fact that Stalin had become the predominant philosophical leader of the so-called communist movement from 1923 onwards is an essential part for people to understand about all of that. So when we come to the current day, I think it's time for us to, in a sense, put to one side some of those questions, because there is a new generation of people emerging untainted into the struggle, thrown into the struggle, who at this stage, as I said, that because there's not a single formulated position on behalf of the Occupy committees, there is a chance that many demands will be made of the system that will allow a significant level of unity to continue to be maintained. And there may be some piecemeal reforms, there may be some re-regulation of finance capital, which would at least enable it to stumble on for a bit longer. But I think when you see the raw figures, there are 100,000 times more dollars in that finance capital economy than there are in the real world economy. Then there's still a problem, because that 100,000 times more dollars has to constantly chase itself in order to maintain its value.
We're talking about communism. Probably a decade ago, we wouldn't have been talking so openly about communism. We're all aware of the extremes of Stalin, of Pol Pot, and many who have claimed to be communist countries. We look at what's happening in China. Nominally a communist country, but perhaps the most extreme in terms of capitalism now.
Absolutely.
Do you see that we can revisit the term communism and
I think so. I mean,
relive communism?
Provided that we open the borders to include all sorts of forms of communitarianism.
Right.
Because they have the same base origin. So that if you're talking not about communism as it was in the 20th century, or as it was portrayed in the 20th century, and I don't go beyond 1923 in my support for communist existence in the 20th century. So if I'm open to a conversation about all sorts of communitarians, and without becoming a communitarianist, but open to discussions about how we might more equitably share in the bounty that is provided by the natural world. It's so simple. If you took 1%, the Tobin tax crowd, for example, in the lead up to the Jubilee 2000, were arguing if you took 1% of every financial transaction that occurred in the finance markets, you would have more than sufficient money available to feed, clothe, house, educate, provide culture and welfare services. In fact, a lifestyle very similar to our own for every person in the world. Or you could take 1% of what we spend on defence, and you could do the same things. Now, so I'm interested in exploring, with the 99%, alternatives for the 1% clubs. Right? I've always belonged to a union where I paid 1% of my salary as my union dues. I've never been averse to that. The church has a wonderful tradition of tithing. In all the churches, in fact, no matter what the tradition, whether it's Islam, who has a tithing tradition, Christianity that has a tithing tradition, Buddhism, which has a welfare tradition of ensuring what's the priesthood and the whatever is supported by the communities. It seems to me that there are notions in there that share much with the essence of what I would see as a communist as being the way to live. Now, I'm not going to live and die by virtue of a tag over which I have no control. I'm happy to refer to myself in these sorts of conversations as a communist person who's come through the communist tradition, if you like. If asked to describe myself, I'd say today I was a revolutionary optimist rather than a communist, right? Because again of the travail, the horror that's been ascribed to, and properly so. I mean, there's no question of the crimes that were conducted in the name of the workers' movement. And so I'm happy to see today anybody who wants to see some basic social justice all in the same tent, and I think that's where we ought to be aiming. Because
I mean that's a really good thing to aim at, but history would tell us that what happens is that often the church, the people of faith, have been aligned often with the more progressive left movements.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet when left movements come to power, the church, other faith organisations become persecuted.
Sure. It's an insane proposition, Paul, and it's one that the Marxist movement has not handled at all well. The question of spirituality, in my view, needs some reflection. I consider myself to be a very spiritual person. I consider myself, in many respects, privileged to have been able to experience blackfelt spirituality, for example. I think if I were, being asked to choose a method of explanation that provided a rationale for the world's existence and the current day, I'd happily adopt the blackfellas tradition, because that notion of spirit being all-encompassing, being constantly present, being embodied in everything that surrounds us, in you and I. You and I are both products of our ancestors, our environment, our geography, all those sort of things. And if you're unmoved by the beauty of nature, if you're unmoved by the splendid nature, as the mystics are, of the cosmology, then you're a lost soul. You don't have a soul, and we all have a soul. Some of them are just horribly hidden and horribly reactionary. And you wonder whether or not the 1%ers have a soul. But there's certainly. If you take the Gates proposition at the best end of that elite, at least he understands that he can't spend $38 billion satisfying his own personal needs, and even others in that financial world. I mean, Buffett and some of the other people have all made significant philanthropic contributions, and that's the thing that's missing from, if you like, the modern day capitalist. Is that there is
the philanthropic nature.
Absolutely.
Although one would argue, when you've got executives paying far less tax than the people that work for them, which has come out very recently. Isn't there some sense that their philanthropy is mismatched in the sense that, the idea of taxes is that all would benefit, not certain sectors.
It's a very strange situation, isn't it? Because if you went to the 1% and said, look, for God's sake, it's only going to cost you 1%, the first 1% of the world's income is all we need. Then you can fight over the rest of it yourself. Who gives us stuff? What do you want to do with that other vacant, that vacant space? But our first task, surely, no matter which tradition you come from, should be to see that the world no longer has a hunger problem, a water problem, a schooling problem, because again we know that in all the issues of concern, we're going to have 9 billion people on the earth. We know that the moment you educate young women, that birth rates decline instantaneously. Kerala, a state in India that's been a Marxist state for most of the post-independence period, has the highest literacy rate of almost any country in the world at 96%. I mean, now Australia's miles below that. They have the highest success rate of infant development. Also the lowest infant mortality rate of any state in India and many across the world. I mean, if Cuba, for example, can go a step further and be exporting doctors back to the first world as part of its aid program, as part of its international obligation, then it is a very simple matter. What's missing is the space within which we can articulate a program that says these are our priorities, because at the moment the 1% dominate the entire cultural and intellectual world via the media and via their ownership of those processes. So
one of the strongest arguments for capitalism, Bill, has been the trickle-down effect. The 1% will trickle down.
Sure.
Cynically, the artist Rory McLeod always says, they put a penny in the pot for the poor, and with the other take 1,000 more.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
Realistically, since the 1800s into the 20th century and beyond, philanthropy is there, but often philanthropy has disguised much of some of the ways. I mean, Bill Gates, despite being a very, very philanthropic person, is still charging incredible rent for the use of software throughout the two-thirds world.
Absolutely. And, as we were talking earlier, has made those profits out of the enslavement and the obscene working conditions of workers in the third world, in China and in other places where they get their components made.
Well, earlier today we were discussing Apple Corporation.
Yes.
And Apple Corporation, probably richer than the United States itself at the moment, but you know that they're making their profits on the back of Chinese sweatshops.
That's right.
By no means are they on their own at this point.
No.
But what you're getting, what's developing, is this sense of the privileged West again taking from the underprivileged other. That may change. I mean, with the rise of China, and recently watching China's movement into Africa and their incredible investment, but it's colonialism at its classic best.
Absolutely.
So where do we go with some of this stuff? You know.
Well, it seems to me that these are the questions of the day. They are the questions that need the most nuanced exploration. I mean, China is, in my view, a set of contradictions which need to be explored a bit. The Chinese bureaucracy, the Communist Party in particular, is the manifestation of that, is a very useful resource for Western capitalists, because it keeps the working class underpaid and in an oppressed condition where their resistance levels are taken away by the state. So China becomes the perfect labour force for the Western world. But within that, you'll see emerging, as you do everywhere, primitive trade unionism, right? You know, because that's the first organisational form that workers, when they become working class rather than peasants working in agriculture and rural-based conditions or self-sustaining. The moment they move into factory circumstances, they start to think like trade unionists. And the current day mob in China are savvy enough and are connected enough electronically to understand that they're being screwed by comparison with, the Honda workers as the most powerful example in recent times. Where they looked up the Honda site in Japan and worked out that they were getting a tenth of what the Honda workers were getting for doing exactly the same work. And so that stuff is coming together. Along with the normal contradiction. I mean, China's got this massive property bubble that's going to go through the roof. And when it does, then you'll see a different range of manifestations of struggle emerging in China. So in all of that, there's no way of predicting what aspect of the crisis will unfold next. But our task, it seems to me, is to follow it as closely as we can in order to interpret it for what it really is. Not just as some superficial analysis. I guess there was another. I think they had 60,000 registered disputes in China last year. So that's a sign of what's been acknowledged. Something's happening.
But going back again in our history and looking at the trade union movement, and much of it was about internationalism. In other words, there was no sense of us doing this on our own. We had to do this on an international basis, that brothers and sisters in other unions around the world would support us, and even to the dock strike, which wasn't that long ago in this country, a couple of decades ago. We saw that there was an internationalist. It seems like more and more, especially the unions in Australia today, are becoming far more protectionist, and that same sense of individualism and greed is showing itself in our trade union movement.
It's a classic difficulty. I've been a trade union activist all my life, and yet in some ways, we talked earlier about the crumbs falling, the 1% of crumbs falling off the table. Well, we've become bloody comfortable, I'm afraid, Paul, as a generational thing, as an industry thing. Many unions in this country have been successful enough to establish at least reasonable living conditions, reasonable living standards for its membership. And in that, we've become complacent and comfortable. There are no question that there's a long, strong international solidarity element to the Australian Union movement, of which we all should be very proud. I mean, the maritime unions and all of those groups of people who've done wondrous things over the years, standing up ships to Indonesia, Pig Iron Bob, pig iron to Japan, proper stances in the Vietnam War, standing up ships that were paying flags of convenience workers. All of those elements remain there, but much more difficult in the current industrial climate, or the legislative climate in particular, for us to continue to do. And as well, a changing nature of the workforce. I mean, that Patrick's dispute we just referred to has seen a whole new layer of workers come onto the waterfront, who aren't of the old order and of the old traditions, if you like, and they've got to be retrained in those traditions. So I think there's a real crisis in our union movement as a part of the global movement, and certainly there ought to be much more campaigning done around the question of an international basic wage, because that would remove the need for a discussion around protection. If every worker in every industry was being paid the same minimum wage for the job they did, there would be no reason for capital to try and race to a new country to find the newest layer of exploitable workers.
I think that's obvious.
And we've never done that. We've never lent our shoulder to that wheel. So I think there are some serious problems for the Australian trade union movement, but they're natural and normal problems that come from being successful in one of the capitalist countries that's managed to not quite completely avoid, but certainly more easily avoid the problems than the rest of the world has in this current round of crises.
Okay, let's move on. This has been a bit of a tour de force of subjects, but we're trying to look at Australian society, in particularly Melbourne society, where we live. I'm a representative of the church. I work as a Uniting Church minister. In some ways, in the same way that the union has been in crisis, the church is in crisis. The more traditional churches have experienced a decline in numbers. There has been growth in the more conservative and religious churches of the right wing. We've seen groups like the Australian Christian Lobby growing up and starting to take a very powerful place, despite of its small nature within the whole concept of Australian society. Having just returned from a large conference, constantly we were hearing the Australian Christian Lobby says this, the Australian Christian Lobby says that, and so in some sense they're playing way beyond and punching way beyond their weight. This crisis in the church, I wouldn't say as an outsider, because you've been around in this church long enough to sort of give some analysis, but what do you think is the future for the churches in Australia at this time?
Those churches who seek to either provide welfare style support, so that you're at the coalface of unemployment, of social dislocation, of homelessness and the intellectual problems that might come with all those things, will continue to survive and to that extent thrive. Those churches that hold up, in my view, false hope, and that is much more in the evangelical area, I think may well have short-term successes because of the, as we would say, the happy clapping that takes place, and the philosophical justifying of greed as being an okay way to live, and for there to be an absence of a need for more traditional social concern, may see them grow short term, but I don't think they can hold their place long term.
But we've seen in America the right-wing Christian lobby become a very powerful movement. What we have here is an aping of that, in the same way that we've seen an aping of much of the Wall Street occupying. We've seen over a much longer period of time an aping of that American style pressure, so issues such as abortion, issues such as death with dignity, are very driven by a conservative agenda when it's looked at the church. Guaranteed there are churches like the Catholic Church that have been saying a lot of these things for a long time, but there's been a grassroots movement of the right wing that's come up in the Christian world and starting to drive this politic. Do you see that as being sustainable, or do you see
No, I mean, because at the end of the day, I recall in '97, just before Bob Santamaria died, he did an interview with Philip Adams on Late Night Live, in which he said his greatest single concern for the future of the Catholic Church was that between 93 and 97% of children who attend Catholic Church schools cease attending church immediately they leave school. Now that just says that there is a major disconnect between where the official church is, where the parishes are, and where, if you like, young exploring minds are. and that doctrinaire approach to the imposition of a religious view has to fail. In particular in this period of the democratisation of information. So that challenge and questioning that every youthful generation goes through will continue to manifest itself. Now, whilst there is a coincidence between the happy clappers, the joyful song singing, money making evangelicals, again, as the crisis itself unfolds, as financial capital collapses as it must, so goes the substance for what's being reinforced by the evangelicals. So you can only be validating experiences where those experiences are real. So when all of those mums and dads, shareholders, and all those upwardly aspirant people who see justification and receive justification in the philosophies and the teachings of the evangelicals, that substance disappears, so too will the evangelicals. There may well be Maggies amongst them that continue. As we see, as you said about the Americans, that very close connection between the extreme right-wing Christian lobby and the Zionist lobby in relation to the State of Israel and its relationship to the Palestinian people. The Maggies believe that once the precondition for the second coming of Christ is in fact the expansion of Israel to be what it used to be in terms of between the two rivers. Now, if that happens, they expect the Messiah to emerge and for the rapture to take place. Now, if they happen to be right.
Some of us could be in a bit of trouble there, Bill.
Some of us could be in a bit of trouble. On our backs watching us, the naked ascend into heaven. Now, fortunately, I don't think there are too many who actually have that as their fundamental principles in their relationship with their God or with their church. And so I do think that the growth for churches will be, in a sense, in the social world as much as it will be in the so-called spiritual world. And those churches that have turned their faces towards generalised horribly around Paulo Freire type philosophical model.
The actual reflection model.
Absolutely. Says that's the future. And they're the church that I would happily work with and talk to and agree with on very, very many questions.
Yeah. We've just mentioned someone that many people might not know here, and that's Bob Santamaria.
Yep.
Bob Santamaria came out of the 50s, out of the political split in the Labor movement between the Australian Labor Party and the Democratic Labor Party. Many people might not necessarily agree with Bob Santamaria, but there was no doubt he was an intellectual.
Yes.
What we are seeing now is movement, but with movement without substance. We lack the public intellectuals of Bob Santamaria within our society, and I would add to that people like Gough Whitlam, who were, truly people of thinking and ideals. Where is this or do you believe that there is a vacuum in public intellectuals within Australian society? And how can we once again give space for these people to rise up to take a place within our community, so we're not just getting the spin, but we're getting some deep, insightful critique of who we are as a group of people?
I was privileged enough to read Voltaire's Candide as a young university student, and was introduced therefore to the wonderful world of satire and the significance of satire in the role of reforming. Voltaire, no one can dispute Voltaire's contribution to the Renaissance and to the emergence and development of ideas. In Victoria, in the last 30 years, 20 years more specifically, but in that period in which almost a bit beyond the John Howard era, if you like, where reactionary ideas and ideology have become the dominant public discourse, it seems to me that you can't go past a Rod Quantock as one of the great contributors to intellectual life and to resistance and to the holding up of hope as a prospect. There are many others. Catherine Devaney, for example, I would put into that same camp as perhaps Rod's niece, politically speaking. But certainly that's been the only continuous upholding of the role of the intelligentsia in the community in the last 20 odd years or so has been the world of comedy. There have been a few, and I emphasise a few, public intellectuals who've continued to make their contribution. So a Robert Mann, strangely enough, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser,
very true.
The odd academic has managed to maintain some level of public profile. have become the butt of a massive assault by the spokespeople for the right wing, Andrew Bolt and others included in that.
But universities used to be the place where much of this was happening. But now universities have changed. They have become almost machines for pumping out degrees. There is greater competition for overseas students, and much of the emphasis is not on the quality of the students, but the quantity of paying students.
Exactly. Universities have been transformed significantly towards commodity production. The commodity being an educational ticket of some sort. The buying and selling of those commodities has badly corrupted what were the key organisational and principal strengths of the academic world. That was to be public critics who without fear or favour. Now, it seems to me there are a number of contributions to that. One is the absence of government funding and proper government support. Two is that within the scientific world in particular, that association that's grown up now around funding of research and the connection between research and the pharmaceuticals is probably the most published example of it, where the degeneration has become so complete that you often find now some academics have been so badly bought that they're no longer capable, in my view, of being, or shouldn't be called academics any longer. They become spokespersons for the aspiration of a drug organisation. And that's a real worry in terms of the way in which universities have performed their function throughout history. That is, that they were always at the forefront of the intelligent criticism of the current. I'm not sure that they're actually capable of recovering in this process, because they are now so heavily into the self-sustaining notion of selling enough of these damn commodities to whoever will buy them, irrespective of the quality of them, and putting aside the question of whether or not there are actually people getting degrees who don't deserve to have them, but who, because they're full fee payers, are getting a more generously assessed degree than
well, one could argue that's been the system in England for a long time.
Quite.
Dollars or pounds in that sense bought education, which was education became a place of privilege. And so that comes to another spot. We've talked about organised intellectuals, people who come through the system. One philosopher once spoke about what was called organic intellectuals, who've grown up through the system. You were able to do that up until recently through the many forums and public debates and the space for public debate. More and more we're cutting down on those spaces for public debate, and I think it's become a sad situation in life where, you know, probably more people vote on something like MasterChef, and we see our Prime Minister visiting cynically and sort of trying to garner support for a hugely declining popularity into that area, and that's taken the place of much of what used to be place and space for public debate. An example would be, in growing up in England, we had two channels, the ABC and the ITV. One was government run, one was a commercial. And so there's a good chance that people actually watched the same television. Wednesday night used to be, they would put a play on the TV, and the discussion on the following day would be around what that may have meant. And so there was space even for obeying intellectualism. There really isn't that space now. I mean, I can't see us having a great philosophical discussion on the X Factor or, you know, MasterChef or any of these, the ilk of these programs.
No, I mean, there's no question that the cultural owners are happy to have dumbed down the level at which they contribute to the world of television and the media generally. If you take the Murdoch empire as being probably the biggest example, the classic example around the world, Murdoch as an intellectual person in his own right has stood on questions that put him to the left of the Labor Party in Australia, as an example, on the question of education and the funding of education. He would be way to the left of the Labor Party. But there's a contradiction in the man, in the sense that what he might say personally is not reflected in any way in the nature of his corporation. And if you take the recent scandal in Britain on the phone hacking scandal, what was missed in all of that discussion, in my view, was the focus rightly is on overcoming the wrongs that have been done to people, but understand that here was revealed the ownership of both sides of politics, the police force, and significant other sections of the state were all at the beck and call of the Murdoch Empire. So they were owned lock, stock and barrel. And in their parliamentary speeches, you actually had a number of them conceding that they'd been cowed by, they'd been bullied by, they didn't go on to say owned by, but they should have been and had the decency, if they were intellectually honest, to go on and say, and we were therefore owned by the Murdoch Empire. The Murdoch Empire set the agenda in all bar one of the last 10 elections in Britain, and probably determined, if not completely, certainly it was the most significant factor in determining which side of politics would win any of those elections. And so that's the public discourse that ought to be had. I mean, how you break the habit of people wanting to read the scum, or the hum, as we call it here in Victoria at some stage, or the news, any of the news of the world outlets. How you overcome the influence of the Fox network in the United States.
Even Al Jazeera has become highly problematic.
But
the English version is a lot more free than the Arabic version.
But I think at the same time, I want to say Al Jazeera, I think, has made a wonderful contribution to broadly of the access to different perspectives of the world. And just to be able to see a half hour a day of Al Jazeera is a wonderful way of balancing out some of the perspectives that would otherwise only come to us through the Western media. That's not to disagree with what might be happening in the Arabic side of Al Jazeera at all, but certainly that's where I think the next level of international discussion has to take place. How do we actually exercise any form of democratic control over any of these processes, whether it's the economic condition, whether it's the political circumstance? I mean, if you take the two wars of the last decade, Afghanistan and Iraq, in every Western country, a majority, up to and including around 70 and 80% of the majority, have been opposed to those wars, and yet governments of both conservative and social democratic persuasion have managed to ignore public opinion and proceed with the wars. Why? Because it serves the interests of their masters, who are the finance capitalists of the world, who, as Eisenhower said in 52, I think, the military-industrial complex is the most dangerous nascent organisation in America today, and how profoundly insightful was that? So the combination of those people who own the finance sector, but who also have a significant hand, therefore, in the military-industrial complex, are laughing all the way to the bank as a result of the policies that suit them, but don't suit anyone else in the world.
I want to move a little bit into this question of media. Media is a very real presence within our community. It shapes opinion, has done for a long time. I mean, if we can't kid ourselves that the papers of the past haven't informed much of what's happened politically, but it seems more so now. I should call a veteran BBC journalist, although I think well seasoned might be another term we might want to use. Kate Addy was recently in Australia, and she talked about the necessity of the media being there, because without the media we have no way of knowing what is happening. That there have been great moments in the progress of the media where they've actually pointed out some of the inadequacies, and even with things like the phone tapping that we saw with the News of the World. If it hadn't been for the Guardian, who had been doing a lot of work over a long period of time to get that information, we wouldn't have had any knowledge of what was happening. We might have had an inkling. I don't think anyone here has any surprise at some of the tactics of the News of the World and like papers. But the role of the media, is it good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? Again, is it a paradox?
It's all those things. It seems to me that there are elements of the media. I'm going to shift for just a second to the WikiLeaks contribution to this process. Lots and lots of people have expressed downright hostility towards Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks project. I'm yet to be surprised by any of the content that has been revealed by WikiLeaks. I've talked to you previously about my understanding of the CIA labour movement connection in this country, which is much more significant than anyone would be prepared to admit. And yet, there is an alternative emerging within all of that. If you take the great success of social media, the new media, social networking, the Twitter sphere and so on, their roles and contributions to the Arab Spring and to the democratic thrust we started this discussion around has been profoundly important.
Yeah.
Like WikiLeaks, if it brings to the surface those things that are available to understand but are not apparent to the vast majority of observers, then that's a damn good thing. If it makes it, more, and I would have been able to say, look, there's no question that the CIA have a huge interest in and influence over a significant section of the Australian trade union movement. People might have laughed me out of the shop, right, over the last 20 or 30 years, because the evidence was not obvious to everyone. But for those who were close enough to observe, it was there and understandable, perceptible. So there is a transitioning role for media, and media, the traditional media, may in fact find itself decreasingly important into the future as alternative means of communication open up. Certainly, if you went to anywhere in the Middle East right now, they might support Al Jazeera. They might occasionally hear a bit of BBC World News Service that gives them a halfway balanced assessment of what's taking place. But otherwise, they would say that the entire Western media was biased against them and was a major part of the continuing support for the Bonapartist regimes that have managed the joints for the last, the post-colonial period, quite frankly. From China all the way through to the whole of Africa. Bonapartist regimes have been the essential way in which ruling classes have maintained control. Now that they're being broken up, Western governments are having a very difficult time trying to redefine where the line should be. I mean, it's okay to support the liberation struggles in Tripoli and in Tunisia but Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and even in Syria, in a sense, where you're seeing
but that way we affect the stability of the region.
Absolutely.
I think stability is a very one-way.
It is.
We're viewing it with one set of perspectives.
Exactly.
I want to narrow this conversation down as we come to a conclusion. And I know the media isn't Andrew Bolt, but Andrew Bolt has been quite looming large within our media here in Victoria. Andrew Bolt, for those of you who don't know, is a conservative commentator and has some very independent and strict and defined views on how life should happen. Recently, he's just been on some charges of which he was found guilty of racism. And there's been a huge outcry in terms of, is this against public freedom of speech? Now, freedom of speech is an important issue, but, there is a sharp sword here.
Sure. Freedom
of speech can mean many things. So let's finish off with a bit of a discussion about the issue of freedom of speech.
Yep.
And we'll go from there.
Well, as we said in relation to WikiLeaks, if WikiLeaks' contribution has been to raise to the surface the hidden, if you like, so the hidden relationships, the hidden agendas, the ones that are, in a sense, where the government spokespeople, especially the American government, let's take them because it's easy to hate them, are expressing a view, then you can be almost certain that there's a level of lying, subterfuge, distortion of whatever it is that they're saying. Okay, so as the alternative media has come into play, as the alternative means of conversation develop, and that's one of our critical tasks, in my view, is to create the space, recreate the space, if you like, that is the public domain, that is the public park, the public
discourse.
Yes, the discourse. The commons, the commons, the public commons, all those
of public opinion.
Yes. All of those things need to be gently nurtured and redeveloped, in a sense, right? So that there's much greater confidence that people can speak out on the big questions of the day. I recall Bolt trying to interview me 20 years ago, and he was clearly interested in the fact that I would say there's going to be blood in the streets all around the world, Andrew, because he could turn that into a very hostile attack on a mad observer like me. Well, I hate to say it, but 20 years later, there has been much blood on many streets throughout the world, and my wishing for it or not wishing for it has had nothing to do with its unfolding. These are the natural, organic developments that are taking place, and people, as the wonderful General Giap said, as the leader of the Vietnamese military, he says, today we're the grasshoppers, but tomorrow will be the elephants. And when you've got nothing left to lose, you can't be defeated. And that was the essential premise of the Vietnamese Revolution. Nothing left to lose, you can't be defeated. And so we've seen imperialism stumble and fall on many occasions over the last 40 or 50 years. None of them have been so substantial as to threaten its very existence. But I think what we're seeing unravel in New York right now, and in particular in Wall Street as it embodies that whole world financial markets, is absolute and utter chaos that has no way of being controlled, no way of being restored to any semblance of stability, but will just simply be an unfolding of a series of crises after crises after crises, to the point where it would be desirable, in my view, for the whole damn thing to go up in one level of contagion. So if there are hackers who are looking into this program and they're capable of bringing the financial systems down by writing a clever program, let's do it, because it's time to end the illusion that finance capital has any real contribution to make to the rest of us suffering in the world, the real world of searching for a job, seeking the dignity of that labour and the right to a decent lifestyle, where hunger and starvation and military and brutal threats are not the order of the day. So I don't think we're too far away from that, but it's a question of recognising each of its aspects as it unfolds, and as I said, most importantly, creating that democratic space within which, no matter what prompts you into activity, you feel at home with the other 99% who might be starting from a slightly different, but nevertheless, in my view, equally justifiable anger of some sort. We all have the right to be angry. We all have the right to say it's not fair, it's not proper, it's not just, it's not decent. A badly overused word, decency, but I know the world is made up of fundamentally decent people. I know that 99% contains 98% of decency. And as I said, it's an abused word, but it's one that we ought to reclaim for ourselves. I'm a decent person. I want to live decently. The only way I can live decently is if the whole world has an opportunity to live decently as well.
Okay. Well, that brings us to conclusion. I want to finish with a curse/blessing, a Chinese saying of "May you live in interesting times." And I think it's fair to say we're living in some pretty interesting times.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bill.
Wouldn't miss it for quids.